The USS Texas was born before the First World War as the most powerful weapon in the world. By the Second World War, she was considered old, tired, and past her prime. But when war reached the distant shores of North Africa, her guns finally roared out. What kind of ship rises from the grave to provide the punch in history's bloodiest invasions? What kind of crew stands against suicidal enemies in war and rescues their ship from the scrapyards in peacetime? Heroes aboard a ship that would help win two great wars. USS Texas, America's World War warrior. At 5:30 in the morning, the battleship USS Texas sits 7 miles off the Normandy coast of France. Her massive 14-inch guns pound German artillery batteries threatening the Allied landing assault. Below deck, crews load, fire, and reload over and over again.
It was a constant thing. You don't have any time to really talk with the guys. You go on and do your job, and that's it.
You couldn't hear anything. Just the noise was out of this world.
While the battleship Texas continues firing its bunker-busting 1,275-pound shells, alongside her, hundreds of other landing vessels move towards the shore. Many are sunk while still at sea, killing thousands and sending Allied artillery and tanks to the bottom of the English Channel. The Texas and other Allied warships move closer to shore, increasing the number of enemy targets and giving their guns an even greater impact. Waves of soldiers hit Omaha Beach and slowly advance, moving forward under the protective gunfire of the USS Texas. The modern U.S. Navy emerges during the first decade of the 20th century. President Teddy Roosevelt believes a great nation must have a large maritime fleet and a powerful navy. Roosevelt and Congress authorized funds for building 16 new battleships, each painted all white except for gilded scrollwork on their bows. They would be dubbed the Great White Fleet.
Theodore Roosevelt started the trend of building 2 to 4 new battleships per year to make the United States Navy a world-class Navy rather than a coastal defense Navy that it had been up through the Spanish-American War.
In 1910, funding is approved for 2 new battleships, the New York and Texas. These are designed to be the most powerful warships in the world. The Texas begins her construction in 1911 at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. 3 years later, she is complete. At 12:30 p.m. on March 12, 1914, the United States Navy officially commissions the battleship USS Texas into service. The Texas represents the pinnacle in battleship design. She measures over 573 feet long and 95 feet wide. At her highest point, she rises 140 feet above the sea. Her displacement with a normal load is 27,000 tons. Running on coal, her top speed is 21 knots. The Texas also comes heavily armored, up to 12 inches along her most vulnerable areas near the waterline. The Texas' first commanding officer is Captain Albert W. Grant. His crew consists of 950 officers, enlisted men, and Marines. They man a series of weapons, including 21 5-inch 51 caliber rapid-firing guns and 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. But the crew's most important role, in fact, the reason for the battleship's existence, revolves around the operation of the Texas' most formidable weapons, her twin batteries of 14-inch guns, rifles powerful enough to hurl 1,275-pound shells up to a dozen miles, a serious threat to anyone or anything along the ocean's coastlines.
The Navy now has the ability to send a projectile 12 miles inland, which will strike a target, leaving a hole in the ground 10 or so feet deep, about the size of a basketball court.
So when the Texas was commissioned in 1914, her 14-inch rifles were the largest guns in the world. She was the most dangerous weapon on the face of the earth.
But her reign as the world's most powerful weapon would be short-lived. The very next year, the British Navy began building battleships that were larger, faster, and contained massive 15-inch guns. While the Texas was no longer the sea's most powerful battleship, she was still a formidable weapon, and she was about to be tested for the first time. On April 21st, 1914, fighting breaks out in the port city of Veracruz, resulting in the deaths of 22 American sailors and Marines. Afterwards, the president orders the Texas to Veracruz as part of a blockade force to protest those actions and protect American interests.
When a squadron of American battleships shows up with 14-inch guns, all of a sudden foreign governments start to listen, and it's gunboat diplomacy.
The Texas remains off Veracruz for a little more than 2 months. She never fires a shot in anger. As tensions ease, America's big stick battleship heads back to the U.S. In August 1914, the First World War breaks out in Europe. In the North Sea, the British Grand Fleet institutes a naval blockade against German ports. Their size and strength proves an effective deterrent until the burgeoning German Navy attacks on May 31st, 1916. During the two-day Battle of Jutland, German ships succeed in inflicting more damage than the British, but the risk outweighs the reward. The Germans retreat back into their harbors and turn their attention to strengthening their U-boat fleet. Across the Atlantic, the crew aboard the Texas can only wonder how she would have fared in what was one of history's largest naval battles. In January 1917, British agents intercept and decode a telegram from Germany to Mexico. In it, the German government proposes to form an alliance against the United States. That fact, along with the continued German aggression on civilian merchant ships and the sinking of the British liner Laconia, shocks Washington into action.
April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany.
President Woodrow Wilson orders a division of U.S. Navy battleships overseas, to augment the British Grand Fleet. The Texas, now commanded by Captain Victor Blue, will finally have an opportunity to show her strength in the ultimate test, war. On February 16th, the Texas was sailing with a convoy when she notices one of the ships break out of line. The crew fires one shot towards a suspected submarine periscope 1,000 yards away. The suspected periscope disappears. The gun crew had gained the distinction of firing the first shot at the enemy from the Texas. Again, on April 17th, the Texas weighed anchor and put to sea on another convoy, to Norway. During the trip, lookouts spot a submarine periscope just as a torpedo passes between two of the American dreadnoughts. Again, her guns open fire at the submarine as destroyers sprint to the scene, dropping depth charges. The submarine disappears, its fate uncertain. The First World War finally ends with the German signing of the Armistice Agreement on November 11, 1918. Sailors aboard the Grand Fleet celebrate as colored rockets light up the sky. On November 20th, British and American ships steam into the North Sea. At 8:25 a.m., the German High Seas Fleet sails through the Allied columns to formally accept its surrender and internment. With the end of the war in Europe, the Texas returns to New York Harbor, and a tumultuous celebration unlike any the city has ever seen. But looming just beyond the horizon, a war is building that will place the USS Texas in an even more treacherous position. This time, her intimidation factor will not be enough to spare her from bloody battle. But amidst her own wounds, her enemies are about to discover just how lethal she really is. In the months following World War I, naval commanders select the Texas for a revolutionary experiment. While stationed in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a large platform is erected over Turret 2. Next, a British-built Sopwith Camel airplane is brought aboard. Then, on March 9, 1919, with Lieutenant Commander Edward McDonnell at the controls, the plane rolls off the platform, catches air, and flies. The experiment is a success. The Texas enters history as the first United States battleship to launch an airplane. In the aftermath of World War I, a new naval arms race heats up as the US, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan continue to build massive, heavy weapons-oriented ships at an alarming pace.
Battleships are very expensive, and many people felt that money could be better used elsewhere in the economy. And so President Harding called for a Washington Naval Conference, and the major naval powers responded and signed a treaty that stopped the building of battleships for 10 years.
So the Texas and many of her sisters or near sisters from her time period, rather than being scrapped and modern ships being built in their stead, are modernized.
The Texas receives a dramatic series of upgrades, including the replacement of her coal-fired boilers with oil-fired ones, increasing her range and fuel efficiency. new anti-torpedo blisters along the sides to detonate any torpedoes out away from the hull. And several inches of increased armor are added along the second and third decks to protect from fire plunging downward. The Texas emerges from dry dock in 1927 and is soon chosen to be the flagship of the entire United States fleet by the Naval Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Henry A. Wiley. Wiley, an 1888 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, grew up in and considered the Lone Star State his home. Admiral Wiley officially assigns the USS Texas his flagship in San Pedro, California on November 8, 1927. Over time, however, naval commanders begin looking at her as an aging battle wagon. After the expiration of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1932, the U.S. built newer, faster battleships and aircraft carriers. These became the supreme warships, and so, in 1937, the Texas is assigned to the Navy's training fleet.
She was old in an age of newer ships that were coming off the waves. She couldn't keep up with the aircraft carriers, for instance. She couldn't sail as fast as the newest battleships.
The Texas is considered too old and too slow for war. And with the continued economic depression, too expensive. The Texas days are numbered. She is destined for the scrap heap. But in 1939, the rising tide of war drastically changes her fortunes.
In 1939, 1940, 1941, the United States began drifting toward assisting the Allied nations, Great Britain and France, and the United States began escorting convoys of merchant supplies from North America, the United States and Canada, over to England.
Her relative old age and her position on the Atlantic meant that she would do convoy duty early in the war. Very dangerous duty, though.
On June 20th, 1941, 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entrance into the war, a German U-boat stalks the convoy, and more specifically, the USS Texas. For several hours, they silently watch the Americans, who are unaware of the danger lurking below. The Germans send a radio message to their commanders in Germany. They have the battleship USS Texas in their sights and request permission to fire. Immediately after the outbreak of World War II, the USS Texas and other warships soon find themselves escorting convoys heading across the Atlantic. Several ships are struck, including the destroyer Reuben James, which resulted in the deaths of 115 sailors. Germany's response was terse. Anybody walking along the railroad track at night should not be surprised if he gets run over by an express train. The Texas narrowly escaped one of these attacks only months
In June of 1941, she was actually stalked by a German U-boat, and the U-boat commander had a set-up shot on the Texas, but the U-boat command in Germany denied him the authority to fire on the Texas because Germany did not want to bring America into the war any sooner than was absolutely necessary.
Whether or not the USS Texas, with her steel plating, might have survived an attack by the German submarine will never be known. But for the USS Texas, her good fortune would continue to keep her out of harm's way. The Texas would be anchored in Portland, Maine, when the attack at Pearl Harbor officially brings the United States into the war. The crew of the Texas will spend the next few months on alert and escorting convoys. Finally, in November 1942, the Texas, under the command of Captain Roy Pfaff, switches gears and joins an invasion fleet steaming towards North Africa. It will be her first true test in battle. The first American troops landed ashore at 5:30 a.m., but it's not until the early afternoon when the first orders arrive from an Army fire control officer to destroy an enemy munitions dump. She sends in 59 shells and demolishes her first target. More calls come, and more enemy positions are taken out, including artillery guns, buildings, and road crossings. The Texas guns also help repel massive enemy counterattacks against the American troops.
The operation off of North Africa is very interesting for the Texas. Our country at that point in time, we were viewed even by our allies as more of a supply depot, if you will, than a fighting force.
The Texas and her crew showed what they could do. They showed what the result of the years of training and technological innovations could bring about with the success of the invasion in 1942.
At the conclusion of the fighting, a number of U.S. Army soldiers and officers come aboard the Texas. Suddenly, an Army sergeant runs up to turret 3, climbs the ladder, walks out to one of the 14-inch guns, and then begins kissing the huge barrel.
Some of the crewmen of the Texas asked him, "Are you crazy? What are you doing?" And he said, "This ship saved our life. We were being attacked by a column of enemy tanks, and the 14-inch gunfire from this ship is what destroyed many of those tanks and made the others flee and kept us from being overrun."
The Texas and her crew proved she was not too old or outdated. Nevertheless, for the next 16 months, the Texas resumed spending most of her time escorting merchant convoy ships across the Atlantic.
In some respects, that convoy escort duty might be considered as not a dramatic role. The newer, faster battleships, like the Iowa-class ships with the 16-inch guns, those ships were going to the Pacific, where they were escorting aircraft carriers because they could keep up with the aircraft carriers. So it was an ironic twist of fate that this old, worn out, in many eyes, ship was the ship that provided gunfire support for the greatest amphibious assault that's ever occurred.
At 8 a.m. on May 31st, 6 days before D-Day, Captain Baker orders the USS Texas sealed. No more contacts ashore. He then tells his men, "The great events for which all of you have been working and preparing will shortly be launched. The ship is now at battle efficiency. The time has come to polish up their weapons." Captain Baker also gives his men a dire warning. The enemy, too, will be prepared and ready.
We were a frightened bunch of young men. I was 18 at that time, and most of my Marines, some of them may have been a little below, most of them were just young recruits. This was our first assignment as far as combat, and we were frightened.
The aging Texas would provide naval gunfire support for Operation Neptune, the naval element of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France.
We pulled into Normandy, I think it was around 3 o'clock in the morning. About 2 o'clock in the morning, we had a nice roast beef dinner. Then we went to our guns and waited for them to tell us.
On shore, 6 German 155-millimeter guns sit on the cliffs above Omaha and Utah beaches. If the Allied assault is to succeed, these guns will have to be neutralized. On D-Day, the USS Texas sits just under 7 miles off the French coast. Overhead, hundreds of Allied planes brave anti-aircraft fire to carry bombs and paratroopers towards France. At 5:50 a.m., 40 minutes before the first Allied troops are scheduled to land, Captain Charles A. Baker turns to Bugle Master Second Class Will John Edelman.
The captain asked me, he said, do you know the bugle call for commence firing? I said, yes, sir. He said, if I give you the nod, I want you to sound that call. I said, sir, the people won't know what it is. So he gave me the nod, and I sounded the call. And then the officer on the day called General Quarters, and that was the beginning of D-Day for us. And it was an eerie feeling.
I had never been around guns to speak of, other than the Marine Corps, and to have those large guns go off, I mean, it's just unbelievable, the power, the noise, the impact on the ship.
At precisely 6:24 a.m., Captain Baker orders a ceasefire. The crew now watches and waits as the first troops move toward the shore.
I saw just hundreds and hundreds of landing craft going in circles, getting ready to go in. I didn't know it, but a brother of mine was on one of those. He was a colonel in the Army. And it was an eerie feeling.
On shore, Army Rangers were already beginning their ascent of the cliffs at Point du Hoc to knock out the German guns.
These Army Rangers, teenagers, kids in their early 20s, climbed rope ladders up to the top of this 110-foot cliff with the Germans up at the top shooting down at them. The combination of the gunfire from the Texas and the assault from the Army troops made sure that all German resistance in that area was ended.
Another interesting role of Texas and the other capital ships at that time was they were the nearest available surgeons and doctors at that time. There were no helicopters around, there were no forward field hospitals yet, so men would be discharged from the landing craft, the wounded would be loaded into them, taken to the battleships like the USS Texas.
Over the next several days, shore-based fire control units continually feed back enemy locations and then watch the Texas guns dutifully put them out of commission. Pillboxes, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries are no match for her 1,275-pound high-cap shells.
There was one instance on June the 9th, 1944, in which a number of German tanks were massing for an attack. The Germans realized pretty early on that the range of the 14-inch guns from the Texas was only 11 miles. And so these Germans were preparing their counterattack just beyond the 11-mile mark. And so Captain Baker, the captain of the ship, ordered the engineers to induce a list on the ship. So they flooded the anti-torpedo blisters on one side of the ship and made the ship list or tilt 3 degrees, which added 3 degrees to the elevation of the guns, which gave them the needed range to destroy the German tanks and wipe out the counterattack before it ever occurred.
The Texas receives orders to sail west towards the French port city of Cherbourg. Capturing Cherbourg is essential if the Allies are to keep up their offensive. The batteries at Cherbourg were manned by the German army, who received their orders directly from Erwin Rommel, commander of the Atlantic Wall defenses.
The U.S. Army troops knew that Cherbourg was being defended by lots of heavy German artillery. So the Army called on the Navy to come over and provide gunfire support for their assault on the city of Cherbourg. So on June the 25th, 1944, the Texas started firing her 14-inch shells at the German emplacements, and the Germans started firing back at the Texas with 240-millimeter shells 9 inches in diameter.
As they're coming at you, you see those things, and is it going to hit you? Isn't it going to hit you? I mean, we're in the middle, and the splashes are all around us.
I know I was scared. You know, we were all scared. And I heard the blasts of those shells hitting the water and the explosions and so on. Then I got to thinking, well, you know, this could be us.
All of a sudden, it got a little quiet. The captain's yeoman, he looked at me and he said, "The next one is ours." And he no more than said that, well, we got hit. I went black. When I come to, my nose was full of blood, and the smoke was still heavy, but the deck was real hot from the flash from the bomb. And then I heard someone start screaming, and it was the helmsman. And he didn't live very long. That's all I remember, except giving first aid. It's kind of a whirlwind thing after that.
As corpsmen carried the mortally wounded helmsman Chris Christensen down to sickbay, Captain Baker carries out the fight from a makeshift command post inside the armored conning tower.
She was straddled over 60 times by large caliber German shell fire. It's amazing she wasn't hit sooner. Texas was an extremely lucky ship because the damage could have been far, far worse. An American destroyer was hit by those same batteries and lost over 20 men from one projectile.
Following the day's shelling, the Texas sails back to England. The aging warship has tasted battle for the first time and suffered the loss of its first crew member. The Texas is repaired and outfitted for her next mission and her eventual destiny out in the Pacific. Her golden year would continue as she headed into the fiercest fighting of the war. After receiving a new dark blue paint job, the USS Texas heads to the Pacific. The Texas, along with an armada of Allied vessels, sits off the coast of Iwo Jima in the shadow of Mount Suribachi. To American war planners, the desolate volcanic island contains strategically important airfields. But to the 70,000 Marines preparing for its assault, the island holds nothing but dread. As the sun rises, the guns of the Texas break the morning calm.
You could just hear the roar of all those guns going off, the impact on the ship, the movement of the ship. It's hard to describe to people how you feel when you're that young and you know those shells are killing people on that shore. I try not even to think of it even today, to be honest with you.
Over the course of the next several days, the Texas continues raining steel down on the Japanese guns. Captain Baker moves his battleship in as close as 2,000 yards offshore in an attempt to take on the enemy's more vulnerable pillboxes and anti-aircraft weapons.
We got so close to the island that we could see the Japs run from a cave to a cave. And man, when they did, there was a shell followed right in behind them. So we had gunnery people that knew what they were doing.
D-Day for Iwo Jima comes on February 19th. The Texas fires her guns until just before 9 a.m., when the first wave of Marines hits the beach. As the assault turns bloody, the Texas begins laying down suppressive fire just ahead of the assaulting troops. Gun crews work as fast as they can, obliterating every visible Japanese pillbox and machine gun nest. But the Marines continue to struggle for every inch.
It was very difficult psychologically for the men aboard the Texas because they were so close. They could see the men ashore dying and being wounded. You see a certain amount of survivor's guilt, if you will, amongst them. It's a hard thing for them to talk about.
1 mile from the shore and 546 feet straight up sits Mount Suribachi, the ancient volcano that was said to protect the Japanese homeland. At her top, 120 millimeter and 155 millimeter Japanese guns rain down 300-pound shells onto Marines and landing craft making their way to shore. The Texas would join in with several other battleships in an attempt to knock them out.
They fired a lot of shells. I don't know, 300 something. They just tore Mount Suribachi up. But Iwo Jima was hard to bomb because there's so much volcanic ash. It wasn't solid earth when you hit it, it just tears it up. It just blew up the sand.
The battleship's guns cannot silence the Japanese guns. It's now up to the Marines on the ground to fight their way up the slopes and take the hill. After what seems an eternity, the ship's chaplain comes over the PA system. Attention all hands. Look towards Mount Suribachi.
We couldn't figure what was going on there. And eventually we saw the Stars and Stripes, whatever the service edition was, and saw Joe Rosenthal's picture. And it was quite emotional then.
While the fighting on Iwo Jima rages on for several more weeks, the Texas does not participate. On March 7th, she is ordered to the Caroline Islands for rest, repairs, and resupply. On March 25th, the Texas finds herself pounding enemy positions on another fortified island. This time, it's Okinawa. On April Fool's Day, the Texas is ordered to the southeastern side of the island and to commence shelling. On shore, the Japanese focus their attention there in anticipation of the impending Marine landing. But it's a trick. The Americans assault beaches elsewhere, taking advantage of the enemy's mistake. The Texas, once destined for the scrap heap, has now taken part in 3 of the most important amphibious assaults in U.S. history.
It's hard to calculate how many more American lives would have been lost had ships like Texas not been there to provide that kind of gunfire support. So those 14-inch guns, which came alive in 1914, are now literally saving American lives in 1945.
The 14-inch guns of the Texas also gave her the advantage of distance. With the ability to fire 13 miles from the shore, the Texas could literally sail away from any danger. In Okinawa, however, Japanese kamikaze pilots brought the danger directly to the Texas.
That's the frightening part, because these men were determined that they were going to kill themselves in order to kill others.
One morning we had 3 attacking our ship. They come over a mountain and come down low. They didn't appear on radar until they come toward the fantail. So right away maneuvered the ship hard left, and we had the whole broadside of the port side to shoot at these planes.
These attacks were devastating the American fleet. The Texas never was struck by a kamikaze. A couple of them came darn close, and one of them came so close that pieces of the airplane flew onto the deck when that airplane broke up when it hit.
In August 1945, the Texas sails into Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, to prepare for the invasion of Japan. But on Friday evening, August 10th, as the men gather to watch a movie, Captain Baker interrupts.
The lights came on and the captain said, "This is your captain, the war is over." Well, that was the end of the movie also. Of course, everybody hurrayed and we went on the spotlights and everything was, you could go up to the galley and get all the coffee and the bread and the cakes and the pies, and they were just giving everything out.
All of us sat down immediately to check our status, and I for one, knew I had accumulated enough points that whenever I got back to the States, I was heading for discharge, so it was a pretty happy time in my life.
The USS Texas, a 31-year-old battle wagon, a veteran of World War I, and twice destined for the scrap heap, has now survived a Second World War.
You have a piece of technology where you can trace everything from the earliest day of flight through the beginning of the nuclear age, and everything that implies socially, politically, economically, and geographically. It is a phenomenal career to a phenomenal and heroic ship.
On April 21st, 1948, the Texas opens as a memorial museum. 40-plus years later, in 1988, the Texas, now 76 years old and in need of restoration, goes back into the dry docks. In the summer of 1990, the USS Texas opens again as a floating museum. Today, she is the only U.S. ship remaining that actively served in both world wars.
I feel real proud of it. You think back how happy you were. We were 390-something days in harm's way. But even at those times, we had happy times.
I personally think we had the most wonderful crew. We backed each other, and no matter what it was.
We worked together. We had no problems at all. I had experiences that I'd never have. Never even dreamed of having.
I hope it floats for 100 more years. It's a wonderful ship. As long as I possibly can, I'll come back to it.